Good afternoon and welcome to this last lecture of the academic year in our Health Justice Institute seminar series. I'm Sheila Wildman, Associate Director of the Health Justice Institute. And I just want to mark to start the contributions of a few people to the success of our series over the year, and that includes my trustee director, Matthew Herder, who's not able to be here today, but most of all, the tireless, meticulous efforts of the Institute's administrative lead, Ashley Johnson, who's back there, hiding in the back. Yes, thank you, Ashley. Here everything, speakers, travel plans, the food, and all the rest. So thank you, Ashley. We meet, as we have all of this year and over the quarter century and more prior in this seminar series, here in the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy peoples, sovereign nations holding inherent rights as the original peoples of these lands. We express our respect for those inherent rights and our commitment to our collective obligations under the Peace and Friendship Treaties and Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. We reflect further on the fact that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched this part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. Today, we are lucky to have with us a speaker who is helping to carve new pathways to health justice, ways of bringing our aspirations for just and equitable realization of health in a field rife with intersecting oppressions and complex, multifaceted threats, economic, environmental, political, to realize these in concrete institutional form. Our guest, Yael Cannon, is Associate Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center. There, Yael directs the Health Justice Alliance Law Clinic, a medical legal partnership training the next generation of leaders in law and medicine to remove legal barriers to health and advance health equity. Professor Cannon's research focuses on the role of law and justice in promoting health equity and well-being for children and families, and has authored chapters in the textbook Special Education Advocacy, The Treaties, Aids, and the Law, and the forthcoming book Centering Families of Color, Identifying Systemic Inequalities and Social Change Leadership, as well as publishing in various other medical, law, and public health journals. Professor Cannon is a Georgetown University Center for Social Justice Faculty Research Fellow. She was recognized as a 2022 American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics Health Law Scholar. She served as chair of the American Association of Law Schools Poverty Law Section and as a member of the Executive Committee of the Section on Law, Medicine, and Healthcare. Last, Professor Cannon was previously an associate professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law and was acting director of the Disability Rights Law Clinic at American University Washington College of Law. Before that, she was an attorney with the Children's Law Center's Medical Legal Partnership. That's a lot of what I wanted to wrap in for you, a sense of this really rich background that Professor Cannon brings to us. Please join me in welcoming.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for that really, really warm welcome. And thank you to Ashley and Sheila for inviting me here and arranging what's already been a wonderful visit for my very first time in Canada. Yeah, I might not go back to Washington, D.C. I might be part of your community forever, so thank you for having me. It's a tough time to be a Washingtonian, but I'm really glad to be here and to get a chance to talk to you about medical legal partnerships and what's known as the MLP model and how they work towards health justice. As we talk today, I'm going to tell a number of stories, and I wanted to just situate first why I think it's important for us to tell the stories of families facing health injustice. So my students and I talk about some of the dominant narratives that over time have driven various laws and policies that have really been the foundation for health injustice in our country and also internationally, and how we have an obligation as those who are fighting for health justice to disrupt those dominant narratives, to surface counter narratives that tell the real stories of people who are facing health inequity on the ground every day. So I'm going to begin by talking about a family that we'll call the Brent family. And a few years ago, the Brent family walked into a free health clinic run by Georgetown University medical students and faculty at a DC homeless shelter. The family had been evicted from their apartment, and this family of 5 had been unhoused for 2 years. When they were in the shelter, they came into the health clinic to get care for their children, and the health clinic had a partnership with our law school. And we had trained the doctors and medical students in that homeless shelter free clinic to screen, and I'm going to talk more about this concept, for health harming legal needs and refer cases to our legal team. So what that meant was that along with a doctor's appointment, the Brent family got a, quote, legal checkup at the doctor's office. And that legal checkup identified that the family needed help overcoming housing discrimination that they were experiencing so they could actually get into housing and get out of shelter. And the doctors referred the family to our law clinic. Our clinic students fought the housing discrimination, which was illegal under our DC Human Rights Act and our Federal Fair Housing Act, through a civil rights case, and helped the family secure housing. And they were doing great, and they were really, really happy to be stably housed. And then came the COVID-19 pandemic, and their Washington, D.C. neighborhood was ravaged. Mr. Brent lost his job, and the family called us and told us that the parents were skipping meals so that the children would have food to eat. And for this family, they were really frightened because they were having trouble making rent. And they knew from prior experience that that was a quick pathway to eviction from their home, and that they could become unhoused again, which was a trauma that was still very recent in their brain. So before I tell you what happened to the family, I want to set the scene in their Washington, D.C. neighborhood for you. And I want to note that I know I'm going to be talking a lot about Washington, and this talk will be about local Washington, D.C., which is probably not something you hear about in the news often up here, but we talk a lot with our friends at Georgetown's O'Neill Institute for Global Health Law and Policy, which is a close sort of partner organization of mine at the law school, about how health inequity is an international and global health issue, but the importance of really zeroing in on local landscapes. And one thing I'm really interested in talking with all of you about and learning more about is what the local landscape of health inequity looks like here in Halifax, in Nova Scotia more broadly, what the national landscape looks like in Canada, because this is the type of zooming in and zooming out that we're often doing when we're looking at sort of structural health inequity in Washington, D.C., and then how it connects to our region and our nation, and then to global health questions. So this is going to be a fairly hyper-local conversation for part of the time, but that's an interesting lens, I think, through which to look at these issues wherever you are, and important because of the differences when we get down to the community level. So this is a map of, it's a few years old, but the disparities persist, of life expectancy in the Washington, D.C. region. So this diamond right here that goes like this, that's Washington, D.C. And this is Virginia, and up there and down here is Maryland. So those are bordering states to our capital city. And you can see Georgetown. This is where the main campus of Georgetown University is, where life expectancy is an astounding, for anywhere in the world, 94 years. That's average life expectancy in the neighborhood around Georgetown University. What's really interesting is in a city with a fair amount of public transportation, there is no metro, which is our train transit. There's no metro stop in Georgetown. That neighborhood around the university, which is very high income, predominantly white, has fought having public transportation and a train stop located in the neighborhood. And that's been, an issue for many, many years. But my students and I talk about how you could be on Georgetown's main campus, and I say that because the law school is not on the main campus. The med school is, which makes my partnership that I'm going to talk about between the law and the med school always interesting and challenging because we're not geographically co-located. Our law school is actually right by the Capitol, and we can look outside a number of our classroom windows in our law library and see the US Capitol, which is always an interesting time to have that view, but especially now. So my students and I talk about how you can be on Georgetown's main campus where the med school is, and you can find your way out of the neighborhood to the closest metro train stop. And you can take the metro down to the bottom southeast corner of Washington, D.C. You have to switch lines. You're probably on the train about 45 minutes total. Our city's not that big. It's about 10 by 10 square miles. So you get to the bottom southeast corner, the bottom of the diamond here. And just in that 45-minute ride, life expectancy will have dropped somewhere between average life expectancy between 20 and 25 years in not a very large city. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the reasons behind this. And the Brent family, they live in this bottom corner of Washington, D.C., which is known as the city's Ward 8. Our city is divided into 8 wards of equal size population, but Ward 8 is high poverty. It's over 90% African American, in contrast to Ward 3, where Georgetown is, which is the city's highest income and predominantly white ward. I know that many of you have spent time studying the social and structural and political determinants of health, but I want to ground us a little bit in how this kind of plays out in the neighborhood where the Brents live. So many of you probably know that the social determinants of health is a large and growing body of literature looking at where we live, work, eat, play, and go to school, and age, and how that has a huge impact on our health. And the research is increasingly showing that as much as 80% of our health is not driven by our biology or by the care we get when we go to the doctor's office, but by these social conditions and the structural and political foundations of them that impact health and health inequity. So what does that look like in Washington, D.C.'s Ward 8? So in Ward 8, we have a lot of substandard housing conditions and housing hazards. We have high unemployment. We have many neighborhoods that are considered food deserts, where there is no access to fresh, quality, healthy food, and a lot of people experiencing food insecurity. We have an entire part of the city that is a medical desert. So actually going back to this map, so this is Ward 8, and this is Ward 7, and this is the Anacostia River. And many people will talk about DC as sort of a separate city kind of east of the Anacostia River. So over here in Ward 7 and 8. Right now in Ward 7 and 8, after a hospital that was widely known to have sort of substandard care and kind of horrible conditions within the physical hospital building shut down, there is no place in Ward 7 and 8 to deliver a baby. And so families have to go all the way past the Capitol and the White House and kind of past where it says District of Columbia in the middle there, really far across town to get sort of the full range of prenatal care that you could get at a hospital and to deliver a baby. And so we have tremendous maternal and infant health disparities in Washington, D.C., and the fact that Ward 7 and 8 are medical deserts are a big part of that. Also in those neighborhoods, there's lower quality education, there's chronic stress, there's a lot of sort of factors of community trauma, and there's a lot of research showing that all of these are social and structural determinants that harm health. We saw these same challenges play out during COVID. So Ward 8 has 11% of Washington, D.C.'s residents, but had more than 20% of the COVID deaths. And so these same kind of factors contribute. In neighborhoods in Ward 8, there are more essential workers who had no choice when many of us during the pandemic were kind of hunkering down, working from home and sort of isolating with our families, but to go into work and be sort of out there exposed. There's tremendous reliance on public transportation for people to get to work and school. So there's very few car owners in that neighborhood. And for many people, they actually have to take multiple buses just to get to basic essentials like a grocery store or to a doctor's office. And we saw during the COVID pandemic, many of the bus lines in the city shut down entirely. And so people had to kind of spend even more time on like switching bus lines. The families that we work with had to take like all of, a single parent would have to take like all of their children with them to take multiple bus rides for hours just to get to a grocery store. And in sort of dense, high density neighborhoods and apartment buildings, it was more difficult for people to socially distance. One thing that we talk about in our classrooms and in our interprofessional collaboration discussions around these issues is how important it is to note that that the disparities we saw during COVID, including around deaths and other measures, and the other poor health outcomes that we see in Washington, D.C. and nationally in the United States, how they persist across socioeconomic status, showing that it's, and clearly with racial implications, showing that these issues aren't just a function of poverty, but also very clearly of structural racism. And we look at how many of the families that we serve, like the Brents, are faced with a compounding burden as people of color who experience health inequity along lines of racial injustice, who are also living in poverty and experiencing all of the harms that come with that. And so we spend a lot of time talking about what is health justice? And I know that that's been a major topic of this series and the Institute as well. And we've been exploring how broadly encompassing the concept of health justice is, how it's racial justice, it's economic justice, it's social justice, environmental justice, housing justice. And COVID especially, I think, presented us an opportunity to kind of shine a spotlight on longstanding disparities, on the role of social determinants of health, and also see how it exacerbated problems that have been here for a long time. And so one of the things that, that I think about in my work is how injustice itself is an underlying condition, and how, we can sit here and feel incredibly depressed about some of this. I know everything I've said so far is really sad and hard to digest. But I think there's some good news when we think about how law and policy got us into this mess, is that we have opportunities, I think, for law and policy to get us out of this mess. And we know that both legal and medical and health systems have had, deep histories of injustice, and also have an opportunity to play a role looking forward in the pursuit of health justice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this plays out with the medical legal partnership model. And I know that this might be not traditional for this lecture, but I'm going to interrupt myself to hear from you for a minute. And I would love to just ask, when you think about individual civil legal issues that might be affecting the health and well-being of low-income patients, what are some examples of a legal issue or a legal need that somebody might need a lawyer to help with that could have an impact on their health and well-being? Great. So substandard housing conditions and environmental housing hazards, we see a lot of that in our work. Actually, last night I was working on a very intense case for a family that has toxic mold in their home, and both the mother and child have asthma, and we know that allergenic molds can be really problematic and both trigger and exacerbate respiratory conditions. But this family had some additional factors because what was found in their unit was not just allergenic mold, but rare toxic mold spores. And this mom, in addition to asthma, also has end-stage renal failure. And so she's in dialysis multiple times a week. She's severely immunocompromised, and toxic mold can kill her. And so when we learned about the housing conditions and the landlord went in and did basically unlicensed mold demolition without any proper safety and containment procedures, releasing a lot more toxic mold into the air, the family had to leave literally in that moment in an emergency. And so we've been fighting this case and trying to get those conditions remediated, trying to get the family to safe and healthy housing, and trying to get them compensation for literally every piece of furniture in their home that was ruined. So there's a lot of advocacy that can be done at the intersection of housing and health when we think about these types of issues. Yes, absolutely. And so we're going to talk about kind of how the medical legal partnership model provides an opportunity for what's been described as legal consciousness, for an understanding that a person has legal rights and remedies, and that a problem that they're facing actually is a legal issue in the first place and is unfair. And if they have rights, in our work we do, I'm going to talk about our pediatric focused work. We do a lot of education advocacy around students with disabilities who often also have health and mental health conditions that require accommodations and certain supports in school that kids are legally entitled to under our federal special education laws. And we do a lot of advocacy to enforce those laws on the books, and then to also look, like you were describing, at sort of inequities in funding structures and things like that across different schools. And one thing I think, I'm really glad you brought up education, because I think when people think about social determinants of health and think about the role of law, I think housing comes to mind very quickly, but education has been described in some literature as the neglected social determinant of health, because it hasn't been described and studied quite as much in those terms. But there is a lot of research showing that one of the single greatest predictors of lifelong health, including what age people die at, has to do with whether they graduated high school or not. So it's a rich body, I think, to explore and to think about when we think of the role of law and policy in health. What about one more? What's another type of legal issue? Yes. Great. And so we have at Georgetown, we have a perinatal law project, which is working on some of these maternal and infant health disparities, situating lawyers in the labor and delivery unit, talking with patients who are coming in for prenatal care, and also after they've had a baby. And many of those women who have high-risk pregnancies in DC are reporting employment discrimination, not having access to accommodations they might need in the workplace. Also, an issue that we see in Washington, D.C. are whether, people are being paid fairly. And so I'm not sure how that's described here, but in the States we call that sort of wage and hour issues, making sure people are getting the full salary that they're entitled, including things like overtime and things like that. And so that's also an area that's sort of ripe for this type of partnership. Okay, so you all did great. And these are a few of some of the other issues. You also mentioned heat, and so you'll see utilities up there. We've been hearing recently, we had, in Washington, D.C., we had a utility shut-off moratorium during COVID. So our electric, gas, and these heat sources, the water company, they were not allowed to shut off utilities when people fell behind on their bills during the pandemic. And part of that was a realization that utilities were really critical to keeping people healthy, right? They need to be able to wash their hands to stay healthy and safe in a pandemic. Well, it turns out you need access to utilities to stay healthy all year round. And there's a lot of research out there about the health harms of being without utility access. And I know there's also grave disparities, and we saw this often when I was doing this work in New Mexico, which is a much more rural region than Washington, D.C., where I am now, where a lot of communities, including tribal communities in New Mexico, were sort of persistently without the infrastructure for consistent utility access, and how that was sort of a major driver of health inequities experienced by those tribal communities. And personal safety and stability, in terms of interpersonal violence. So obviously there's direct connections around health and safety, and seeing those as a social determinant of health, but there's also sort of many kind of ricocheting legal needs that appear for people who are experiencing interpersonal family violence that also then function as social determinants of health. So one of the things, and Sheila mentioned this when she introduced me, is just how interconnected so many of these issues are. So if I was better at doing PowerPoint, there might be some better way to describe that these aren't just little separate floating bubbles, but Venn diagrams or whatever. Maybe somebody can help me who's good with graphics think about this. Just how there's been some research around this concept of tangled threats, and I think that really does a good job describing of what we see with the families that we talk with, because a lot of times, in order to figure out where to start, we have to kind of map out the range of problems. We have to kind of start to entangle them, kind of see which area of legal need, is most pressing to the family around their goals, and then, where we kind of start in terms of doing our advocacy. Because sometimes it's not just a matter of triage, like they talk about in the medical field, but also kind of seeing where different laws might be kind of leading to problems in other areas of law. I wanted to show this graphic around, this is from the US Department of Health and Human Services, but these are the same kind of areas of social determinants of health that have been identified by the World Health Organization and are kind of looked at globally as well. And one of the things that I've looked at in my work kind of relates to something you said about people sort of understanding their rights or having access, really having access to the legal information and resources to be able to advocate for themselves at an individual level or their communities at a more population level. And so one thing that struck me when I was looking at this graphic is just how deeply connected the areas of law we were just talking about are to the main domains of social determinants of health, and how, at least in the United States, very few people who have civil legal needs related to these areas have access to a lawyer to help with them. And in the United States, that's described as the justice gap. And there are many, many reasons that have been studied around this justice gap. Of course, it's expensive to provide lawyers to to address these health-harming legal needs and hold systems accountable, but many people also don't even know that they have a legal issue with a legal remedy, and that they have rights that are being violated. And then if they do, and even if there are legal resources available, there's many, many barriers, including rural access to justice issues that I'm sure are experienced in many parts of Canada, and I've actually heard some speakers talk about that through the lens of health inequity as well. And also just sort of trust in the legal system, physical access, transportation barriers, childcare. And so it's interesting to see the overlap around these issues, but then it's also interesting to think about how healthcare could actually lower barriers to access to justice. And that's a lot of what the medical legal partnership model is trying to do. So let's talk a little bit more about health justice and how it particularly played out for our medical legal partnership work with the Brent family. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about one other family and how we can use that to understand kind of the specific various activities that can advance health justice that lawyers and doctors can work on together. So there's a kind of growing body of literature around this concept of health justice. A lot of great work coming out of scholars in Canada as well as the United States using this term and this framework. And this idea of leveraging law and policy to eliminate health disparities. And I think it's really intentional and important to use the word justice as part of this framework. And so, for many years, people have talked about health equity as having, a fair and equal opportunity to achieve health. But adding the word or substituting the word justice really forces us to examine the role of law and policy, the role they have played, like I said, in getting us into this mess, the role that they can and must play in remedying these problems. And then also the role that we as lawyers can play in both enforcing the laws that we have on the books in some of the ways that I've been describing, and then also in reshaping law and policy more structurally. So in terms of the enforcing laws we have on the books, so with the Brent family, when we heard back from them during COVID, remember I described their difficulty putting food on the table for the kids and their worries about paying rent. So it turned out when Mr. Brent lost his job that he had been denied unemployment benefits that people are entitled to in Washington, D.C. in his situation when they lose a job. And so we helped him appeal that denial and get that income starting to come through. Because of his decrease in income, they were actually entitled to an increase in food assistance that they had not been provided. And so we argued for an increase in our supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits for the family. We were able to counsel the family on their rights under the eviction moratorium that we had at the time in Washington, D.C. during the pandemic, and also to work with our local housing authority to negotiate a rent reduction and some housing assistance for the family. So with that legal advocacy to enforce the rights they have on the books, the family was able to become food secure, to avoid eviction, and ensure that sort of the laws that we already have on the books were in place to ensure that they had the conditions they needed to generally be healthy and get them through the pandemic. And like I said, I think a lot of our work is also aiming to focus on how we can learn from these experiences and the families that we work with and hear from them to think about policy change. So with the next story, I'm going to talk about that as well. So I want you to take a look at this van in the top picture, which I'm going to tell you about. This very brightly colored van in a moment. So we were very lucky at Georgetown when we got our medical legal partnership off the ground to find these incredible medical partners that provide really low barrier access to healthcare in those same neighborhoods I showed you at the bottom of the diamond in Washington, D.C. that have historically been medical deserts for many forms of healthcare including primary pediatric care. So MedStar Georgetown, MedStar is the largest regional health system in the mid-Atlantic part of the United States where DC is located. And they operate in partnership with Georgetown University. And they have this division called Community Pediatrics, which entirely is focused on providing healthcare to families in neighborhoods that have been medical deserts for primary pediatric care in DC. So the van that you see at the top is a full doctor's office on wheels. It provides pediatric care, behavioral health care, nutrition assistance, all right outside the front door of a number of low-income neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., so it parks in public housing complexes and other areas where there really haven't been pediatricians. At the bottom, you see a high school. And remember, I was talking about the Anacostia River. So this is an Anacostia High School at Ward 8, in Ward 8. They have not just a school nurse in there in the high school. They have a fully functioning pediatrician's office. They provide immunizations. They provide labs. They provide reproductive health care to the teens. They provide support to LGBTQ students around their health care. And they provide behavioral health care right in the high school. So I'm going to tell you the story of the Cooper family. They walked onto this mobile van that you see in the top picture for a checkup, and were able to kind of at the same time getting this low barrier access to healthcare, get low barrier access to justice. And we talk about, this is a picture in Anacostia High School. That's Dr. Kaskin and two of our law students. Dr. Kaskin is the medical director of the high school-based health center at Anacostia High School. And so we talk a lot about how our work begins with just really identifying where the law is impacting health and thinking about this concept of health harming legal needs and how just making those connections is really kind of the first step. And so before I talk to you a little bit more about the Cooper family's experience, I want to just kind of show you how the medical legal partnership model works, at least for us at the Health Justice Alliance. So it begins with families coming into the doctor's office, whether they're on that mobile clinic van or whether they're at the high school-based health center. And when they're in the waiting room at the doctor's office, they get some paperwork. They actually get a mental health screening, and then they also get a legal screening. And that legal screening is administered for families who bring their kids in for like kind of an annual checkup, which is called a well child check in the US. And then additionally, when the healthcare staff in those clinics think that it's a good time for another screening or an initial screening for a family. So that screening is done on an iPad in the waiting room. And if the family indicates concerns, I'm going to show you the screening tool in a second, but if the family indicates concerns about different legal issues that we work on, those answers populate into the electronic health record, and the provider can see them in the doctor's office when the family goes back there for their appointment and can kind of elicit further information. We've also heavily trained the providers, and we do ongoing training. Our medical partners have regular, what they call academic meetings, where they're staying abreast of the latest developments in pediatric care and medical care. And as part of that, they are learning about the law. And they're learning about legal rights that their patient families have, especially as those rights are evolving. As you can imagine, this is a time in the US and in DC in particular, where there's a lot of changes happening all the time. And so we are constantly trying to stay abreast of those developments and to train our medical providers. That was also very important during the COVID pandemic when our laws were shifting around things like housing and utilities and food assistance and health insurance very rapidly. So the doctors are also trained to kind of organically spot issues as well, because they have a really good understanding of kind of the legal rights and common legal issues facing their patient population. And so if through one of these conversations or through the screening tool, a family kind of screens that they may have a legal issue, the provider gets their permission, and then submits a referral to our legal team. And then we obtain the necessary consents, and the legal team meets with the family to assess the need for intervention, and we do a lot of collaborative advocacy after that, which I'm gonna talk about in a minute. So this is our legal checkup form, and I know it's hard to see, but I think you'll be providing these, or you can provide these slides, make them available after, yeah. So, and what we did was we developed this screening tool by talking both to patient families at these clinics as well as to the providers, and then getting input from the patient families about how we were asking the questions. I don't know if you guys can read, but it has some questions like, have you seen mold, bugs, mice, rats, peeling paint, or water leaking where you live? Do you ever go without electricity, heat, or running water? Does your child need more help in school than he or she is getting? And then also, we have provided our medical partners with these charts that are like laminated in the doctor's office. And these are to be used in conjunction with the American Academy of Pediatrics Well Child Check screening tool called Bright Futures. So pediatricians in the US, when they are doing annual checkups, they have sort of best practice questions just as part of the physical checkup in the doctor's office that they are supposed to be exploring. And so we have helped the doctors build in some additional layers of legal screening into questions they already have to ask. Because you can imagine that doctors are very busy and they have such a limited time with their patients, and so we want to make it really easy to build in like processes that don't add a lot of additional time, that are already around standardized and validated questions that they're asking. And so we've kind of created this color-coded chart, and it has follow-up questions in the first column for the providers for questions they're already asking about, depending on how the patient answers, when to refer to our legal team, and a little bit of information that they can give families or remind themselves about how we can help. So, all right, so let's get back to you for my last few minutes, the Cooper family and what happened when they came into the doctor's office and were handed this questionnaire. So as part of the health checkup that their youngest child, Mia, got, she was tested for lead exposure in her blood. And some of you may have heard about the fact that children can be poisoned by lead in paint or lead in water. And we had a huge crisis, I think that made international news in the town of Flint, Michigan, where predominantly Black, low-income communities were living in housing with very high levels of lead in the water and in the paint. And when children get lead in their blood, unlike adults, they have difficulty processing it out. And that can lead to developmental delays. It can lead to lifelong brain damage. And in communities in the United States where the housing stock is older, like in Washington, D.C., where there have been communities there for a long time, and many of those communities were, the homes were painted when lead paint was still permissible in the US, and also where we have very old infrastructure and water systems, and there continues to be lead in the pipes and in the waters. This becomes an issue of health justice. It becomes an issue of racial justice because it disproportionately impacts communities of color. So the medical providers on the Kids Mobile Medical Clinic frequently test children, young children, for lead in their bloods as a result of this. Well, Mia was tested and she had very high levels of lead in her blood, and it turned out that she had been lead poisoned. At the same time, the family got this legal checkup, and the providers learned that the family was living in really poor housing conditions. And this was a huge problem during COVID when families were stuck at home for long periods of time because you can imagine, so this family, in addition to lead in the water and the paint, they also had mice and mold and roaches in their home. And so you can imagine like having exposure to those substandard housing conditions is bad for your health when you're home like just a few hours a day plus sleeping overnight. But when you're home all the time, we ended up seeing a lot of really significant health impacts once kids started coming back to the doctor more frequently as the pandemic conditions were improving. And that was true of this family as well. And the legal checkup also revealed the challenges that Mia's family was having securing necessary educational services and accommodations. She was struggling in school because she had been lead poisoned and was having these developmental delays. Also, and maybe this is a problem you were lucky not to have here, I don't know, but her medical insurance had been terminated not because she wasn't eligible, but because of an administrative error, which is something we see a lot for families who are low income and qualify for Medicaid, which is our public health insurance in the United States. And of course, without health insurance, the medical treatment and behavioral health treatment that she needed for the lead poisoning was not going to be accessible to her. So our students, when we get a case like this, we are lucky to have some time in the classroom learning about these issues and kind of understanding the why. And so in Washington, D.C., the story is very much around structural racism in housing and in the way that the built environment has been designed over the years. And so we had redlining and restrictive covenants that segregated families of color into substandard housing stock in Washington, D.C. So it's not an accident that Wards 7 and 8, where I showed you at the bottom of the diamond, are predominantly families of color, and that is substandard housing stock, and also literally across a river from where most of the jobs are without great transportation infrastructure, right? And also where there's a lot of factories and other sort of environmental justice issues. And so the history of segregation in Washington, D.C. and many parts of our country is very much also the story of health injustice and the story of housing injustice. And the other thing to note is that many communities in the United States lack sort of robust laws that would prevent these types of housing conditions, including lead poisoning. So our laws are very much structured to sort of kick in when a kid has already been lead poisoned. Okay, well then there's things that like our public health system has to do. For example, or there might be like some accountability like to a landlord who's renting to somebody from the public health department, but it's very much on the back end. And then the laws that we do have are often under enforced, leading to many of these problems. We see the same thing happen in the educational system. So the school system in DC often misses kids with developmental delays, and especially for kids of color, forces them into the school to prison pipeline. And they experience disproportionate exclusionary school discipline and involvement in our juvenile justice system. And we know that all of those things then have an impact on health as well. So here's some of our students outside of the DC Superior Courthouse in Washington, DC. And so we look at opportunities to do legal advocacy for families like the Coopers that will advance their health and well-being. So in this situation, our students marched into our housing court. They advocated to get these housing conditions fixed, to get the lead remediated and the mice and the mold and the roaches. They advocated to restore the child's health insurance. They advocated to obtain comprehensive educational and developmental evaluations and special education services from the school system. And they spent time trying to learn about what policies and structures and systems in our city needed to change as a result of stories like Mia's. And you can imagine, Mia's story is not the only story that our medical partners have seen or that we have seen of kids who've experienced significant lead poisoning. And so in the medical legal partnership model, we call this the patients to policy approach. So this idea that we are working directly with families on the ground, We are hearing about their concerns, where they see health injustice that they're experiencing, and we're using our medical legal knowledge to say, hey, this is like a pattern with the law. This is a gap or a problem, either with the way that the law is written or the way the law is being enforced. So here are students, and you can see this is a team of medical and law students testifying at our municipal legislator, the DC Council that makes our laws in Washington, DC. And the team representing Ms. Cooper came to recognize that lead laws in DC really are extremely reactive, like I was describing before, and really just require interventions like after a child has been lead poisoned. And we actually had a gap in DC where our laws didn't even kick in until there was way higher levels of lead in the blood than even our federal government through our Environmental Protection Agency and our Centers for Disease Control had like established as problematic. And so they went about advocating for a change in the law to require prevention and to require really robust inspections of rental housing in Washington, D.C., because we know this is a systemic problem, to have real like best practices around lead inspections happen before a family moves into a rental home. Parts of that legislation have passed, and the rest are still being heard by the DC Council. And you can imagine that when our medical providers put on their white coats and go down to the DC Council as physicians and tell their story, and when our client families. So one of the most amazing things that happened with Ms. Cooper is she had never been to our city hall. She had never been involved civically in any way, but she really wanted to make a difference and make sure that this didn't happen to anyone else. And so she came to the DC Council as well and told her story. And you can imagine that hearing those community voices and hearing those doctors' voices, no offense to those of us who are lawyers, but they come with a lot more credibility than those of us who might be frequently knocking on the doors of legislators, you know, through a legal lens, trying to make a difference. So you can kind of see how the different components of the medical legal partnership model played out for this family, and the idea that we are trying to help people at the individual level, but we're also trying to transform healthcare institutions. You can imagine that when we have lawyers in the labor and delivery unit at a hospital or in pediatric practices, that all of a sudden the healthcare institution is starting to operate a little bit differently, and starting to kind of see health justice as part of their work, especially as we start to study it, you know, and see results. And then, like I talked about, that patients to policy approach, that improvement and prevention at the population level ends up being where we can really have such a powerful impact. There is a National Center for Medical Legal Partnership. It's located also in Washington, D.C., but at a different institution at the George Washington University School of Public Health. And when you go to their website, you can see just sort of all of the different partners that are involved in the US in the medical legal partnership movement. And the main sort of other areas where there's been a lot of literature around medical legal partnership outside of the United States has been in Canada and Australia. And I think they need to do a much better job of beefing up the part of their website and the sort of international collaborations, but there's a page called International MLPs, and they're featuring one of the earliest medical legal partnerships in Eastern Ontario, out of the Hospital for Sick Children and a few other healthcare institutions. They work with a number of law firms who provide pro bono legal counsel to families, and they've been doing this work, I think, since 2009. So their work, I think, has been pretty robustly studied, but there's a lot of opportunities for us to do sort of cross-border and international collaboration around some of these issues. And just to end, I wanted to say that one thing I'm really interested in and would love to hear your thoughts on is how we can really harness what it means to be having these conversations in an academic environment and how that can be a place to make a big difference. So in this picture, you can see in the white coat in the corner is Dr. Eileen Moore. She is one of our medical champions on the medical school faculty at Georgetown. She runs the health clinics that Georgetown has in homeless shelters in Washington, D.C. I talked about the Brent family at one of those. And one of the things that she and our other physician partners tell us often is how they wish that they had learned about the role of the physician advocate and how they can make a difference when it comes to law and policy, to the social and structural determinants of health, while they were still in medical school, while they were forming their identities as practitioners, as advocates, and how they wish they could continue to have sort of ongoing education built into their profession. In many medical schools in the United States, there is a lot of discussion in the classroom about increasingly around health inequity and around social determinants of health. There's very little experiential work happening or opportunities for medical students, nursing students, public health students, health administration students to gain the skills to actually do something about these issues. And so what that means is that in many healthcare practices, the main drivers of health problems are not discussed in the health clinic. And so, this model, interestingly, was started out of Boston, or it's credited with being started in the early 2000s and late 90s out of Boston Medical Center, when physicians were seeing kids coming into the emergency room, out and back in again and again for really serious asthma attacks, and giving those kids the best possible health care they could, and those kids still coming back to the emergency room. And when they started talking to families, they learned that many of those families were living with these substandard housing conditions that exacerbate asthma. And the doctors started saying, we can't get you better, at the doctor's office. If you're going back to a home, with mice and roaches and mold, your child is going to continue to have asthma attacks. You have to get these conditions fixed. And they'd come back to the emergency room again and say, I talked to my landlord, and my landlord said, it's your responsibility as the tenant, and I don't have the money. Or I contacted my landlord, and they ignored me, right? And so the doctors were like, we are lacking the tools in our toolbox to get these families healthy. And so they ended up contacting legal aid in Boston and some colleagues at Harvard Law School and getting a partnership started out of the emergency room at Boston Medical Center and then into pediatric primary care practices, and that's where kind of this model was born. Now it's spread not only to perinatal health, but to oncology, to veterans issues, to elder care issues, to people living with HIV/AIDS, people experiencing substance abuse, returning citizens coming out of incarceration. So there's many different populations now being served by this model, but there's an increasing recognition that we can actually make a real tremendous impact when we train those who are still in school to have these skills, to partner interprofessionally in professions that are often very siloed, and to be silo busters, so that when our future doctors, our future nurses, our future lawyers go out and practice, they're actually practicing differently because of this, and they're practicing collaboratively towards health justice. So I think that's what I wanted to share with you today, and I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts that you might have. Thank you.
And I'm welcome, I'm going to be quick, but I wanted to first thank you for such a rich and really important lecture. And I also just wanted to say, also some folks in the room are aware of us, that we at the Health Justice Institute invited Yael here in part because we're very interested in kind of deepening our own institutional capacities in this direction. So I partly want to just put you on notice of that so that people around here who may have an interest in following up on that with me, I welcome that. And I'll also just say a little bit, to go a little bit further, that there is a group of doctors who came to us at Health Justice Institute with this, kind of like you've described, with a specific concern. There are many areas of concern, but it was around the care needs of kids in child protection that they receive, so some grave needs they receive. And so that was the spark or the seed to start thinking more about the many kinds of work that we could do, drawing on the many very expert folks who are doing bits and pieces of the kind of work you hear here. So I want to turn it to a question. In fashioning the project that you've just described, what would you say was one of the biggest challenges, like sort of early on, and how did you meet that?
Yeah, great question. So I don't know if any of you have had the same experience on either side of this question, or as a bystander or observer. But as a lawyer, when I walk into a healthcare setting or a hospital, usually I'm not warmly welcomed. What is the lawyer doing here? Like, that must mean there's a problem. Like, is a doctor getting sued? That's kind of the common kind of perception. And there's a lot of mistrust between our professions. We also just learn differently, honestly. Like, one way that somebody once described this to me, which I really, really see play out, we have fourth-year medical students who spend 1 to 2 months with us at the law school, which I think is really amazing because it's, our med school curriculum, our undergraduate medical school curriculum, which is actually after your regular undergraduate degree, is then another 4 years of school before you go into your residency. So in 4 short years, you're really having to do a lot, mostly like very clinical training, right? But that Georgetown has said that 1 to 2 months of that medical school training can be in a law school doing this advocacy is really interesting and progressive and different. And so I have medical students in the classroom with me. And so we're doing a lot of like problem diagnosis and problem identification and problem solving together. And I can see how much the medical students like thrive and get excited when there's like really clear answers, and like the answers to a problem are just like very black and white, and like, yes, like check, these like, this is clearly that diagnosis, And many times as lawyers, when the answer is that clear, like our clients are screwed. Many times we're like very excited when there's like shades of gray, especially for somebody who, comes from a more marginalized community. Oftentimes the laws are stacked against us, right? And the power dynamics are stacked against us. So we're looking for shades of gray. And that's where we can thrive and argue. So it's just one example of how our professions are oftentimes thinking about things differently, learning differently, have mistrust to overcome. So we had to do some of that. That was a challenge from the very beginning, is just to realize like we're all on the same team. And we realized very early on, and I don't know if that's an issue here, but like our law school and medical schools had like been doing very deep work in many of the low income and racially minoritized and marginalized communities in Washington, D.C., just like in parallel and not together. Like probably sometimes serving some of the exact same people and families, but just separately. And so there was a lot of like building of bridges that was needed. It's really wonderful that you already have so much collaboration, it seems like, just that the Health Justice Institute exists and there's interest across the university and the community in these issues is a great foundation to build on. But once we were able to really get people in the same room and talking about some of these challenges, our med and law students now in the classroom, they learned so much from those different approaches. Our discussions of these problems are way richer for the sort of interdisciplinary perspective that we bring to them. It's a great question. So, I think we've gotten more and more open answers to the screening as time has gone on, because we've established trust in these communities. We've shown we can make a difference, and there's like a lot of word of mouth that happens, and we've had to really talk to our students about what it means to do, trauma-informed lawyering, culturally humble lawyering, to really be consistent and persistent and show up and really focus on building that trust in these attorney-client relationships and do real like client and patient-centered work in order to do that. And I think that has helped. But we're always going to have people who either like the questions are confusing, or they're like, I'm not going to put that on paper, or why would I tell these people these issues? And so the training of the doctors and nurses, and even like the receptionist who sits at the front desk and like checks people into the doctor's office and like chats with the families kind of more than anyone, all of those people have been trained on these different areas of law and legal issues. So there's a lot of sort of spotting that happens in organic conversations. There's research showing that nurses are one of the most trusted professions. It may not surprise you that lawyers are not, but my nurse friends are. And so, we get to build off the trust that that they have built in order to get access. Because I think many of these families, like, they would not find themselves to a lawyer, like, but for this partnership. And then in terms of like the sort of fact that these are tangled threats and that many families present with multiple legal issues. So one of the things that we do is if a family gets referred to us, we tell them, we're going to ask you a few questions about some other things, including some other connected things. So for example, we found that many families who are behind on rent are also experiencing challenges with their economic insecurity, not unsurprisingly, such as employment issues or such as issues with their benefits and like their food assistance, like I was describing earlier with one of the families. And so we give every family sort of like a financial health checkup, even if they don't come in with those issues, as long as they're comfortable. And most of our families want that help, because we say to them our goal is to try to figure out how to like maximize your income, minimize your debt. Are there predatory practices, like where there might be consumer protection advocacy we can do. And a lot of times we are able to spot those issues because we are taking a very holistic approach. It's a great question. Yeah, you're right that that's a big question, and it's unfolding in real time. But these questions are happening, and we're trying to build collaborations across jurisdictions to share kind of best practices and legal strategies for continuing to do this work, for different forms of resistance, for the laws that we still have. Because one of the biggest challenges I think we're seeing is that people think that their legal rights have already disappeared when they haven't. And so helping people understand, like, you still have those rights. And there's still legal advocacy we can do. And in many places, the courts are still places where we can make a difference. The municipal and state legislators are still places where we can make a difference. So looking for those opportunities for health justice that are still there, as well as thinking about how we can have a voice on the federal level, which continues to be a really challenging question. Yeah.
I feel like that is the start of a whole other of really important a challenging conversation. But I'm going to move in just because I know some people will have to go, but I also invite folks who do want to come up. And
I'll stick around.
After, to please do that. And of course, there's a seminar in which some of the students will be also having more conversation. But before I invite you to join me in thanking Professor Cannon for that just really wonderful and truly inspirational lecture, and I say inspirational not in a vague sense that I feel good, but in a sense that there's some concrete bits of advice and experience that I think are really relevant to us. So before I do that, I just want to mark again that this is the last lecture in our seminar series this year, and I want to thank people for coming out and being part of these conversations where we've been deliberating together about what health justice means. I'm looking back at and they're trying to mask my voice. There, but it's already moving in on us. Just was looking back at the series, starting with a lecture titled "Reclaiming Scientific Expertise to Protect Public Health and Health Justice." How relevant is that? Reclaiming and protecting scientific expertise. And then the next one, imposing health and social services without consent, looking at BC's legislative frameworks around mental health. So the kind of criminalization and securitization of health problems, such a live issue for all of us. Seeking substantive equality in First Nations social development was the next one, Professor Naomi Metallic. So reminding us of Indigenous health justice and how that is absolutely central to our conversations about health justice. No health justice without Black justice. We had that wonderful talk with Elle Jones, her sister Zilla Jones, and Randolph Riley talking about systemic discrimination in Canada's prisons and jails, another side of health justice we just can't lose. On to determinants of planetary health with Nicole Redvers, right, the Indigenous planetary health expert from Western, who spoke about health justice and the intersections of people and planets, who just expanded our minds right out to the edges of the cosmos, thinking about health justice interconnections. And then Nova Scotia's eugenic history next with Leslie Digdon, right, talking about Nova Scotia's history of eugenics and how that history must be something that we understand closely so that we don't repeat it. And then last week, right, becoming legal and self-managed abortion in 1970s Italy with Elena Caruso, giving us our legal history, you know, historian's vantage on a story about the fight for abortion rights in Italy at a time when it was community groups, grassroots groups that were doing that work with each other at a time when the fascist government was absolutely, you know, not in line with the aspirations and work of those groups. So ending with today, I'm so pleased to have had this journey with all of you, and so excited about the work that you're going to be able to do in your own spaces advancing this cause. So please join me in thanking.
Oh, thank you.